Okay, so we're going to start something new tonight. There is still ongoing, I'm talking about koans out of the Mumonkan, and I'm going to touch on that briefly this evening, but I don't want to just get us stuck on a whole series for a long time just about koans, because that can be fairly dense. So tonight I'm going to talk about poems by women in the Dharma, particularly or specifically old poems by women in the Dharma. So I'm going to start by reading a couple of paragraphs from this amazing book, which is The First Buddhist Women. Susan Murcott is the author. There is a text in the Pali Canon called the Therigatha. I'll talk more about the Pali Canon when we get into this and one of the reasons why this is a remarkable book. But this is poems of 2,500 to 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. Well, it's more like 2,500, it's towards the outer edge of that, by enlightened and enlightening women. So this is the foreword, this is the beginning two paragraphs from the foreword by Diana Winston. As a practicing Buddhist and a practicing feminist, I've always had a hard time reconciling my love of the Buddha's teachings with what I saw as historical Buddhism's dismissive attitude towards women. First, I had to contend with the Buddha abandoning his wife and son Rahula in order to reach enlightenment. Then I was uncomfortable with the nearly 1/3 more rules for ordained women than men, and the stipulation that even the most venerable nuns had to bow down to a 10-year-old male novice. Also, many of the texts were filled with stories about monks succumbing to temptresses. The first monastery I practiced at in Thailand displayed a life-size painting of a sexy woman. Fishhooks dangled all over her body, most tellingly located at her nipples and genitals. What are you getting into? I'd ask myself. It would have been so much easier if I could have been into a nice goddess religion instead. So this talks to deep trouble, not just in Buddhism and the history of Buddhism, but the history of our culture and the history of religion, right? We talk about the axial age being an age of a big shift, and it was a big and powerful shift. It was a shift from orthopraxy, which is about how one practices the right way of practicing love and compassion, to orthodoxy, which is right belief, and orthodoxy, which is now leads us to, do you believe in the word of God? Do you believe that Jesus died for your sins? Do you believe that Muhammad was the last servant and prophet of Allah? And so forth. So there's this huge shift. But I think, to me, I don't know historically whether it lines up this way, but it feels like it probably does. It was also a shift into this patriarchally dominated approach to religion, where a lot of the female approaches to faith and female approaches to spirituality kind of put aside and replaced with the more masculine energy, if you will. So there are two texts I'm going to focus on in these talks. This is one. The other is this book. It's called Daughters of Emptiness, which is by Beata Grant. This is I won't talk so much about this today, although I'll do two brief things from it later. This is a book of poems out of China, the first 1,000-ish years of Buddhism in China, which was from around the time of the birth of Christ through roughly 1000 CE. Both of these are kind of remarkable texts in many ways, and one of the ways is there simply ain't a lot of this stuff out there. There is not a lot. So the male writings and teachings absolutely dominated in both of these cultures at the time, and at the time the men were in charge, so they wrote stuff down. History, as they say, is written by the victor, right? So the texts that survive are male dominated texts. So you've got this, and the texts that are then studied are male dominated texts because it's the men who are the teachers, right? So you've got this diminishing prioritization of female teaching. So these are really unusual and quite remarkable teachings in that regard. There are some other wonderful books which I will draw on from time to time. This pure and simple Upasika Ki Nanayon is a lay Thai teacher, and she's basically a self-enlightened woman. She woke up and then she wandered off, and people said, this woman gets it, and so people come from all over to hear her talk. She is remarkable, and she is widely well regarded. This is a book I haven't read in many years. Fortunately, Beth has a copy of this, and so I borrowed Beth's copy. This is by Grace Shireson, and Grace Shireson wrote this book, Zen Women, and this tells stories, a lot of stories from the history of Zen about women who showed up in unexpected and very interesting and powerful ways, and a lot of their stories have been suppressed, but little bits of those stories come forward to us. So there's a glimpse in there of those stories, of women in Zen through those stories. This is a powerful book, The Hidden Lamp, Stories from 25 Centuries of Awakened Women. So this is a book of koans, and it's a recently assembled book of koans. For those not familiar, koans are these little pithy stories, typically in in Japanese Zen Buddhism, although most of the stories actually come out of China and moved across to Japan when the Japanese texts were being pulled together. And they're things like, does a dog have Buddha nature? Mu, which means no or cutting off. And of course a dog has Buddha nature, so why would you say that? That's the sound of two hands clapping. What's the sound of one hand? These are things that we can't solve logically. They propel us into the non-dual mind, and by becoming absorbed in the question, we forget everything else. We become this non-dual question, an answer presents itself, and they become a realization of emptiness, a realization of non-duality in our direct experience. Those classic koan collections were all written by men. They're stories of largely male monastics, but the people who assembled them are generally a single man in each case, and in some cases a second man would then come along and write a commentary or some clever verses on it, all of which is really powerful teaching. This is so different, because in those practices what happens is you read the koan, and Norman Fisher in the introduction to this says that is a grasping approach to teaching, because you've got to go after it. You've got to be desirous of the teaching, and you as the student have responsibility for going to the teaching and finding it and waking up. This he talks of as a giving teaching. These stories, there were two women dominantly responsible for this, whose names are on the cover, but there are a lot of other women who were involved in pulling together the 100 koans. And each of these koans, each of the 100 stories in here, has a commentary by a female Buddhist teacher, contemporary female Buddhist teacher. So there's this profound intention of pulling together collaboration. And in the style of the stories chosen, and in the style of the narratives, there's a greater level of openness, there's a greater level of offering, there's a greater level of invitation, there's a greater level of vulnerability in these. So when we look at the differences between masculine and feminine teaching styles, and part of the point here is actually the core point, really, one of the two core points. One is just the gender prejudice over time, but the other core point is what therefore comes down to us is teachings with a dominantly masculine energy, and that is limiting for everybody, male and female alike, because we are all combinations of masculine and feminine energy. And if the only energy that comes through to us in the teaching is this grasping approach, we're missing hugely in opportunity and hugely in understanding. So there's a trope that is common, which is that the male teaching is strong and it's wisdom based, and the female teaching is gentle and it's compassion based. That is a gross oversimplification. Arguably it's flat out wrong, but at best it's a gross simplification. Feminine energy more broadly is gentler, it's more grounded, it's more responsive and passive. And I'm going to invite this up, and I want conversation. I want us all to talk about this, because this is just what this feels like to me. Because when I read a lot of the male teachings, they are not open in the same way that a lot of female teachings are. So however we get there, this book to me, and contrasting this book to a lot of the classic koan collections, epitomizes, or is a good way of illustrating the two different teaching styles and teaching energies. So, back to this book. This starts with the story of Mahaprajapati, who was, and her disciples. Mahaprajapati was the Buddha's stepmother and the woman who raised him. So Buddha's story, Buddha was raised in this palace, and so the story goes, he was lavishly protected from anything unpleasant, any suffering, and then he encountered a sick man, an old man, a dead man, and notice those are all men he encountered, and then a mendicant, and he said, that's what I want, I need to go find truth. There's another story she reveals in here which I hadn't heard before, which is Buddha also, on the night he left, his harem, because of course it wasn't just he was married with a child, he had a harem, he was a rich man, they had harems. His harem were all asleep, and he saw them in these awkward and ungainly poses, and so he said, oh my goodness, these women who I thought were really beautiful really aren't, I'm out of here. So there's, this is more of the tropes that we deal with in this story. So Buddha left. Excuse me, there's a piece I missed here, I'm sorry. So Buddha's mother, when Buddha's mother was pregnant, she went off to her home country to give birth. Birth came upon her on the way, so she gave birth to Buddha out in the open and in the wild. About a week after giving birth to Buddha, she died. Her sister, Buddha's aunt, this woman Prajapati, therefore became the woman who raised him. So, at the age of 25, 30, Buddha leaves home. His stepmom at the time is about 45, 50. Buddha goes into the wilderness, practices for 6 years is the generally discussed time frame, and then he comes back awakened. So he's left his wife and left his son behind. He comes back awakened. He talks to the people, and they say, oh, there really is something special going on here. And then he goes back off into the wilderness again and takes a whole bunch of people who became monks. So Mahaprajapati, at that point, she becomes Maha because she becomes this leading figure. She and Yasodhara, his wife, both like the teachings and decide to follow the teachings. So she becomes like the local Buddhist community, female community leader in that old town. So there's a war going on. Buddha goes, talks to the folks involved in the war. They all say, wow, I don't know what we were thinking of. Let's all start fighting and let's all become monks. So they all do. And when they do, there are a whole bunch of women who are left without husbands, left without protectors. And in that culture, that can't work. So they want to become Buddhists, and they become disciples of Mahaprajapati. When Buddha leaves, his harem don't have anybody to look after them. So they become disciples of Mahaprajapati. So this idea of the 500 disciples, 500 is just a big number, but it's a lot of people who became Mahaprajapati's disciples. So we'll read a couple of poems from these disciples which show up in this collection, the Therigatha. So Mahaprajapati decides that to do this right, she wants to formally become a student of the Buddha. So she goes and says, can I become your student? He says, we can't have women students. No. So she asks him a second time, and then a third time. And it is generally recognized at that time that if you ask for a third time, the teacher really has to give you an answer and has to give you the best answer. And the best answer is still no. So Nanda, who is Buddha's cousin and closest disciple at the time, sees Mahaprajapati crying and says to her, what's going on? And so she tells him. So he goes and tries to intercede, and he does the same. He asks the Buddha, wouldn't it be right to let these women become disciples? And Buddha says, we can't do that. It just doesn't work in this culture and at this time. He asks second, third time, still no. So then he tries another approach, where are we? Are women able, Lord, when they have entered into homelessness, to realize the fruits of stream entry, once returning, non-returning, and arhatship? Yes, Ananda, they are able. If women are able to realize perfection, and since Prajapati was of great service to you, she was your aunt, nurse, foster mother, when your mother died she even suckled you at her own breast, it would be good if women could be allowed to enter into homelessness. If then, Ananda, Prajapati accepts the 8 special rules, let that be reckoned as her ordination. Cool, women are allowed in. 8 special rules. It happens to be written in the back of this book. 1. Nuns, no matter how senior, must always defer to monks regardless of how junior. 2. Nuns must not speak ill of monks. Nuns must not rebuke monks, although monks may scold nuns. Nuns must receive full ordination from both male and female sangha. If they have violated a Vinaya or a monastic rule, nuns must confess fortnightly in the presence of both the male and the female sangha. Nuns must seek dharma instruction from monks on a regular basis. Mahaprajapati went to Buddha and said, you know, I'm not sure that first one, which is they've got to subordinate themselves to all monks, no matter how old or senior, I'm not sure that one really works. And Buddha says, well, sorry, but that's what you've got. Because if that one falls, they all fall. But he won't let that one fall. So what comes down to us today in the monastic and in the monastic orders is that in the Theravadan tradition, men have something like 211 precepts, and women have considerably over 300 precepts. Women still have to follow these 8 special rules. Women cannot be teachers in these traditions. In many Buddhist countries, women are treated like animals. I mean, they are seen as being of an animal nature, not just being pejorative. That's how women are seen. They're seen as being tempters and just lesser. So this persists. Anyway, so I'm going to read you some of these poems, and there's a couple of things that come out of this. There are styles in these poems, and I'm going to say a couple of words about this book and read one of the poems out of this so you get a sense of the style here. The Therigatha, which is the collection of these poems, there are, it's not a big book, and I should know how many. It's not a lot. It's less than 200 poems in the whole book. And many of them are really short. The longest one is like 2 or 3 pages, but most of them are less than a page long. And the Pali Canon is like this big, and the Therigatha is like this big. So these are really precious. But there is a style in the Therigatha poems which is of this, you'll see the style, but it's kind of the pervasive style of a lot of the poetic stuff coming out of Buddhism. And this, they're beautiful poems. So, poem 1. Seeing the elements as pain, start that again, I'm sorry. Seeing the elements as pain, don't come back to be born. When you throw away your longing to be, you will live at peace. Now that's not nihilism, that's not saying I'm going to go kill myself. It's saying I'm just not sucked into this whole idea of becoming. Having an identity, being something is just not important. I'm letting go of all of that. Seeing the elements as pain, don't come back to be born. When you throw away your longing to be, you will live at peace. Here's a second one from a person by the name of Upasama. Upasama, you should cross this flood, this place of death, so hard to cross. Upasama, you have conquered Mara and his forces. Endure this body, it is your last. And another. Friend who has left home in trust, take delight in friends. Cultivate good qualities to gain peace. I've got two more out of this book. I was in full possession of body, speech and mind when the root of craving uprooted, I was in full possession of body, speech and mind. With the root of craving uprooted, I have become cool and quenched. So the theme running through these is of an end to becoming, a putting out of the fire. The fire is a metaphor for the fire of passion, the fire of emotion, the fire of clinging. Nibbana means quenching or putting out, cooling. So that's the theme that pervades all of these. Peace is when the fire is released. And the last one here, I gave up my house and set out into homelessness. I gave up my child, my cattle, and all that I loved. I gave up desire and hate. My ignorance was thrown out. I pulled out craving along with its root. Now I am quenched and still. So now I'm just going to read a couple of that. I'm going to just do something very quickly out of this, and then I'll say a couple of concluding words and finish. So out of this, there is just there are two poems. So the Chinese style, of course, is very different. The Chinese style of Buddhism is very different, and the Chinese style of literature is very different. The early Indian style of Buddhism was very much about releasing the aggregates, releasing our passions, and this sense of non-returning. The Chinese style is much more about engagement in nature and seeing Buddha nature in a plum blossom or a river or the sound of a stone hitting a bamboo, and the haiku of the frog dropping and jumping in the water. Plop. Actually Japanese, but it's, that's very much the flavour. So here are some poems from the 12th century, one particular person from the 12th century. Spring morning on the lake, the wind merges with the rain. Worldly matters are like flowers that fall only to bloom again. I retire to contemplate behind closed doors a place of true joy, while the floating clouds come and go the whole day long. So these come from in many ways a tradition that is parallel. It's a tradition in which there actually were a lot of enlightened women. There actually were a lot of very serious women who were actually recognized by male teachers. There are many transmitted teachers in both the Chinese and the Japanese Buddhist traditions. But those are periods that interrupt long periods of that not happening. And they are very much a minority and very much a tradition that, because the dominant culture was the masculine culture, the male culture, was not brought forward. So what survives as teachings and as poems is still relatively small. But beautiful stuff. So here's the second poem by this person, whose name is Zhen Jui. The hidden birds on the treetops sing without pause. The sky clears, the rain stops, the window brightens. From the west came the wondrous meaning without words. It may be gold dust, but don't let it get in your eyes. So, concluding words really, why am I bringing these forward, and what do I hope we'll get from looking at these together? I'm bringing it forward, and the answer to both of those is the same thing. It's to recognize history and acknowledge history and the hurt that we do, the whole of humanity as a result of this history that continues today, and to, as a group, try and for ourselves redress a gap in the teachings that come down to us, and try and bring forward some of these very powerful teachings from female ancestors in this case, that can open up spaces that a lot of the male teachings, the patriarchal teachings, just don't access. And the poetry is a beautiful approach. Poetry on its face is a linguistic expression of non-duality. To try and understand a poem is risk completely missing the point. Poetry takes us to that place, or invites us into that place of non-duality, invites us into that place of letting go of subject and object, letting go of what can be defined, and just truly creating this openness and receptiveness. So with that, I've probably said too much. I will say no more.